Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. We are really excited to have Kate Caldwell from University of Illinois at Chicago do a discussion today about disability and bisexuality. Before we get started, I wanted to just take a moment to do some housekeeping. Everyone is in listen-only mode, so if you do want to submit comments or have any questions, feel free to pop those into the chat. If you have any tech issues, also use the chat function and we can try to troubleshoot any of those. You do have the ability to turn on closed captions by selecting the arrow that says closed captions, and it will show your subtitles. So I wanted to just give you a little overview of the project that brings us here today. First of all, my name is Tara Ahern. Welcome. I'm the project director for the Illinois Self-Advocacy Alliance, excuse me, and also one of the co-chairs for Illinois Imagines. We are here today to really because of a grant project through the American Association of People with Disabilities. It is an award project that I won earlier this year, and my project focuses on disability and sexual violence, and also healthy relationships and healthy sexuality. So just for audio visual purposes, I am a white female with long blonde hair and a plaid shirt. And I am really excited to be here today. So my pronouns are she, her. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kate Caldwell.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm so glad that you asked me to be a part of this. It's a really important project, and I'm really glad that we're having these conversations because, I know I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but these are conversations that we oftentimes don't have enough. So I'm really excited to talk to you all about disability and bisexuality today. My name is Kate Caldwell. I'm a clinical assistant professor in disability and human development at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And I also want to start by sort of situating myself. First, I'll describe myself. I'm a white woman with shaved sides and a cotton top hairstyle, and wearing a white and black striped sweatshirt. And my background is the Golden Girls Kitchen. So if you have cheesecake, make yourself at home. Also, I identify as a bisexual woman and a person with multiple invisible disabilities. And a lot of that goes towards informing the work that I do, which really just started with me trying to understand what I was seeing and experiencing. And when I was trying to find community, either bisexual community or disability community, some of the experiences that I had in those spaces. And then that, of course, being an academic turned into my doing research in this area. So really what I want to do is we're going to go over a lot today, but all of it is really just a conversation starter, right? These are all conversations that we haven't really had yet and that we really should be talking about. So I want you to sort of think about it that way. Otherwise, you might get a little overwhelmed. So let's get started. Click. All right, so on our agenda today, we're going to start by talking about some things that you may or may not know about disability and bisexuality. And I've got a little graphic here of how disability and bisexuality intersect. And it's actually quite a lot. They overlap a lot more than people realize. And then we're going to talk a little bit about pride and the coming out experience and some similarities there. Then we're going to talk about these concepts of invisibility and erasure that are very prevalent in the bisexual community, but we haven't necessarily dug into in the disability community in the ways that we could. And then we're going to talk about the impact on health and mental health, and we're going to address one of the biggest problems in the community, which of course is intimate partner violence. So let's get started. Did you know that there are a lot of intersections between disability and bisexuality? And in point of fact, my entire young adulthood, I kept being told, bisexuality is not that important because there just aren't that many of them. But it turns out that recent research shows that a little bit over 50% of the LGBT community are bisexual. And also LGBT people are much more likely to have a disability. Oh man, my graphic got cut off. Wait. I was supposed to have a large screen there. Come back. No, come back into the fold. There we go. Technical problems. All right. So for example, prevalence of disability among straight men is about 22.4%, 22.5%. Straight women, it's about 25%. Gay men, it's about 26%. Lesbians, it jumps up to about 35.5%. But then among bisexual men and women, we see it actually going up even more. And so one of the questions that I think is worth asking is, well, why are LGBT people so much more likely to have a disability? And we're going to get back into that more later in this presentation, because it's going to make a lot more sense when we start looking at the impact of prejudice and discrimination on one's health and mental health. But I think it's really important to recognize that because the bisexual community represents such a large portion of the LGBT community, and they're more likely to have a disability, the fact that we haven't been having these discussions around disability and bisexuality is a clear gap. But it's also really interesting because when you look at the discourse that's been happening in the bisexual community for ages, they've actually been talking about disability for years. And a lot of the leaders in the bi community are disabled people. And so there's actually been this discussion going on in that community that we haven't actually seen in the rest of the LGT community that's been happening in the bisexual community, especially among bisexual people of color. And they actually have even higher rates of disability, right? So we know that over a third of bisexual people are also people of color, and we don't have the stats breaking it down by disability, race, and gender. However, if we look at sort of what's indicated by the existing research, we can infer that bisexual people of color, in particular bisexual men, of color, are much more likely to have a disability than other identity groups. But we don't have those statistics. Well, why don't we have those statistics? Let's look at that. So people often misunderstand, and I've got a little graphic here of bisexuality, since we're talking about it today. We're getting the T on it. People often misunderstand what it means to be bisexual, just like they often misunderstand what it means to be disabled sometimes. And a lot of this leads to stigma. So in the bi community, this is biphobia. In the disability community, this is ableism. And it shows itself in different ways, but that have very similar hallmarks, especially when you're looking at someone who has an invisible disability and whose disability may not be believed, and they may be asked to prove their disability time and time again. Well, that's exactly what bisexuals experience on a regular basis, is their sexual orientation oftentimes isn't believed. Sometimes they're believed to just not have accepted their homosexuality, and maybe they're just being greedy. Maybe they just can't make up their mind. Oftentimes we are referred to as quote unquote fence sitters, right? And so we often aren't believed about our sexual orientation, our identity to begin with. And there's also a lot of stigma that goes with that, such as we are cheaters. There's one of the things that I encountered in my graduate studies was, some people blamed us for the spread of AIDS and HIV, right? Because we apparently are deviant, right? And that's something that's very familiar to the disability community as well, being seen as non-normative, being seen as somehow deviant, as not fitting in, as being a burden in some way. And so those are all similar experiences. But it also leads to a lack of services and support for those groups because of that pervasive stigma. I remember when I first came out as bi, I started looking for bi support groups. And every organization I went to in 3 different states, 3 different cities, they charged for their bisexual support groups. They didn't charge for their gay or lesbian or trans support groups, although there weren't that many trans support groups at the time. But they charged for the bi ones. And their reasoning was that, we shouldn't have to be providing these services. There's not enough of you. It's costing us money to provide this support group. So if you really want it, you're going to need to pay to have this service, right? So we see, and it is better now than it was, and we're seeing more organizations actually providing support for the bi community, but a lot of times it's not specific to bisexuality. And this also comes down to a lack of funding. There has been zero research dollars for bisexual research and programs. Bisexuality is often overlooked by disability programs. Oftentimes when you look at the research that's being done, it'll look at lesbian and gay, or it'll look at queer groups, but it never asks someone if they identify as bisexual, and sometimes actually doesn't allow them to identify as bisexual. It kind of forces them to choose another category. However, disability is not actually overlooked by these bi programs. However, these bi programs don't have funding, so there's not really much that they can do. In point of fact, if you've read Cherie Eisner's book, she talks about disability all the time. It's beautiful, it's wonderful, it's fantastic, but people in the disability space don't read bisexual scholars. And in point of fact, queer scholars and LGBT scholars oftentimes don't read bisexual scholars. And so this conversation ends up sort of stopping before it even starts. But I think it's really important to recognize that there's not just a lack of funding, there's no funding for bisexual specific research and programs. And we're going to come back to this again and again. So both of these groups, and indeed where they overlap and intersect, experience invisibility and erasure. And we're going to talk about what this means. And we also experience pride and coming out, but perhaps differently than what you're conventionally used to hearing about. So let's dig into that. And I don't know if I keep seeing something on my screen popping up. If there's questions in the chat, I can't necessarily see them, but I will address them later. All right. But I do have a visual impairment. So, all right, let's talk about pride and coming out. This is one of my favorite slides. Let's talk about how well do you know bisexual history? And let's start with, bisexuals have been a part of the movement, the gay and lesbian liberation movement, from the very beginning. It was only later that they started being excluded. And this is how erasure happens, right? Is that the bisexual involvement or bisexual identities become erased historically. And this erasure happened because of what's called strategic essentialism, which was proving successful in furthering the acceptance of gay and lesbian people, but it happened at the expense of bisexuals who are now seen as a threat. So basically this has to do with what's called, homonormativity, which is where gay and lesbians were trying to argue, we don't get to choose who we are born this way, it is something inherent in us, and we can't change, right? Which is a very important argument when you're looking at something like conversion therapy, which is trying to, tell somebody that they can change their sexual orientation through behaviorist treatment. Now, for those of you in the disability community, you might be familiar with ABA, or applied behavior analysis, I think it is, right? Which is basically the same thing as conversion therapy, but for the autistic community. And they were actually both developed by the same person, which is, I think is Lovas. Developed both conversion therapy and then ABA. He was like, well, that's that for, autistic people. But they're actually both extremely harmful. Well, why then is it that the lesbian gay community decided to lean into strategic essentialism and say that, hey, our sexual orientation, our identity is a part of us that we cannot change, and yet the disability community leaned away from it? And it actually said, no, essentialism is not the way to look at disability, because we may have an impairment, but we are still people despite our impairment, right? That our impairment is not what's disabling, it's actually society, right? Following the social model of disability, it's society that is disabling, not us. We are not, so we can't be blamed for our disability. Right? So for some reason, there was this point where both of these communities went separate ways. But what ended up happening was that there's consequences to those decisions, right? And I think it's worth asking why choice is so important in the disability community. Yet when it comes to the LGBT community, we don't even want to really talk about sexuality or identity being a choice because it's a threat. And that's where bisexuals often seem threatening or seem dangerous because it sort of calls that into question. And that's the argument that we need so much to make sure that we aren't being harmed. And I think that's a conversation worth having, but I got a little bit off track, so I'm going to come back to it. So bisexuals have been a part of the movement from the very beginning. And in point of fact, the Stonewall was a police riot that was led by trans people of color. And two of those most notable figures were Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, who are pictured here. But it's also important to recognize that many of these leaders were also bisexual, including Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. Now, if you Google it, you're going to find information both confirming this and disconfirming this. And that's exactly the problem of bisexual erasure and invisibility, is how do you prove that bisexuality, that someone was bisexual if they came out at some point as lesbian or gay? Does that somehow invalidate that they may have had bisexual attraction or a bisexual life? I think it's important here perhaps to give the definition of bisexuality, and I probably should have done that earlier. And here I'm going to refer to Robin Och's definition, and which has been the most well-used one in the community. And it does not rely on binaries. That's one of the stigmas of bisexuality. In fact, it says that bisexuality is having attraction to the same or other genders. And so it doesn't say, oh, hey, I'm just attracted to male or female. And that's one of the arguments that we've seen recently to try and pit the bisexual community against the trans community, when in fact, many trans people are actually bisexual. But rather it says, okay, I'm attracted to my own gender, whatever that is, and other genders as well. And so there, you may also be wondering in this moment, well, then how is it different from pansexuality? Well, pansexuality is basically saying I'm attracted to people regardless of their gender. It doesn't really factor into it. And pansexuality and bisexuality overlap in really important ways. And there has also been a lot of trying to position right now by those two communities, even though we're part of the same community, at odds with each other, when in fact that's not true at all. And there's actually some people who identify as both, and it's a beautiful thing. And so a lot of these, this bi-antagonism is created in the community in order to, successfully argue for rights and to make progress, because the LGBT community has been disenfranchised over the years. However, it's really important to be aware of and understand the ways that bisexuals have sort of been villainized in this process and how they continue to be today. One thing I also want to mention here is I've got a picture of Brenda Howard. Brenda Howard's also known as the Mother of Pride because she was a bisexual woman who planned the first Pride parade ever. And she also assisted people throughout the country in planning pride parades in their cities. And so Brenda Howard, a bisexual woman, actually created the pride parade as we know it today. And she was also a disabled woman later in life, and later became a wheelchair user. So I think that's really important to, honor as well. So let's talk a little bit more about this pride and coming out. We talked a little about this essentialism already, and it's interesting how differently essentialism gets used in the LGBT community versus the disability community. But also I want to talk about exclusion at pride. People with disabilities and bisexuals both experience exclusion at pride events, even though we started it. For people with disabilities, a lot of times this is because pride events are not accessible because they can't get wheelchair access, or they're only allowed in specific areas of pride. I remember once I went to a pride parade with a bunch of my friends, and the disability seating area was, not kidding you, downhill from the porta potties. And the porta potties were indeed, they had a river coming out of them, right? So it was nowhere that anybody wanted to actually spend time. I also went to a pride parade with a friend of mine that was a wheelchair user. And when it got so crowded, people were just climbing over her in her chair and she was getting crushed under the weight of all these people, right? So oftentimes pride has not been a welcoming and inclusive place to people with disabilities. A lot of times it's also not a welcoming place for bisexual people who are often told that we're not welcome there. That is not our community, especially if it's someone in a heterosexual appearing relationship. They're oftentimes told that it's not for them, or that they need to really come out, that they need to accept their authentic selves. I can't tell you how many times I've been told that I wasn't being authentic just because I was insisting that I was still bisexual. And so this kind of thing happens all the time, but that's because pride, and to a great degree, the LGBT movement and queer spaces have become ahistoricized through that erasure of the contribution of the bi community. And so here I have some bullet points of different ways that we see exclusion at Pride for the disability community. It's through lack of access and accommodation, also lack of disability representation. How awesome would it be to see a gay AF disability float going down the parade route? That would be fantastic, but we don't often see that. In fact, I don't know that I've ever seen that. But they also fear disability. A lot of times they see it as a threat to queer and or feminist ideals. And we've seen critique of this in some of the disability and some of the crip queer literature that's come out about how, feminism basically says that women are supposed to be, strong and independent, and they see disability as a burden. They see it as them being put in a caregiving role. And instead it doesn't recognize that feminists can be disabled and that doesn't make them a burden. It doesn't make them dependent on someone, and that disabled people can actually be independent and powerful too, right? And so sometimes we see the queer and especially the lesbian feminist community push against people with disabilities because they sort of see it as a failure of the ideals that they're advocating for. And then with bisexuality, we see them being seen as not welcome, not quote unquote queer enough. If they're in a different sex relationship, they're seen as straight. If they're in a same-sex relationship, they're seen as not authentic. They're not allowed often to march, hold signs, or have a float. In fact, there's actually quite a lot of discourse online that you can find around bi groups trying to get an MC or a parade leader to be bisexual, and people pushing back and saying, well, this is the gay pride parade, why would we want a bisexual person leading it? So the fact that in recent years, and I do mean in like the past 2-3 years, we've actually started to see some bisexuals leading pride parades is actually a huge win for us, which is kind of messed up given we started it. But okay, let's But also, again, they fear bisexuality, these same groups, because they see it as, again, a threat to these queer and or feminist ideals, because they see it as someone who's saying, I'm not going to, as them not being their authentic self. And so it really creates a catch-22 for the disability community, for the bi community, but especially for bisexuals with disabilities who are caught in this truly liminal space of belonging and yet not belonging in any of these communities. So let's talk about coming out. And I know there's a lot on this slide. There's a lot on all of these slides. I really wanted to make sure to give you guys as much information as a reference as I could going forward, so that you have it at your fingertips. And if you want copies of these slides, please feel free to reach out to Tara or myself, and we're happy to share them. So coming out of the closet is often used as a metaphor for people with disabilities and bisexuals alike, but does it really fit? For gay, lesbian, and queer people, it's seen as a rite of passage and leads to community acceptance. But this isn't necessarily true for bisexuals, right? Research has actually shown that coming out is qualitatively different for bisexuals. they are often not seen as fully coming out or as having to come out twice. Many report constantly having to come, quote unquote, out because they're not believed when they do. I can't tell you how many times they've come out. I come out constantly to everyone. I came out to my mom again yesterday. I mean, it's just a constant process. So qualitatively, it's different because it's not a rite of passage. It's something that you do constantly. Being out as bisexual doesn't necessarily lead to LGBT and plus community acceptance. It's often seen as a phase rather than a rite of passage. Now, let's look at the disability community and coming out. Coming out about disability is also qualitatively different for people with visible versus non-visible disabilities, right? Someone who has a visible disability often will say, well, I don't need to disclose my disability because, you know, they see the chair or they see the crutches, you know, they see a visible marker that I have a disability. Whereas people with non-visible or invisible or non-apparent disabilities, whatever language you prefer, they'll often have to talk about the process of disclosure, when they choose to disclose and when they choose not to, and how they make that decision. And I wanted to share with you something that Carol Gill wrote about the 4 types of integration in disability identity development that I think is really, really, really instrumental to this discussion about coming out. There are 4 types of integration that she found. The first is coming to feel we belong, and that's people with disabilities integrating into society. But the second is coming home, and so that's integrating within the disability community itself. The third is coming together, internally integrating our sameness and our differentness. And the fourth is coming out, integrating how we feel with how we present ourselves. So it's a process of negotiation rather than simply a process of acceptance as we traditionally see it in the gay and lesbian and queer communities. And I think that has a lot more in common with the bisexual experience of negotiating coming out on a constant basis than that coming out as sort of a rite of passage, a stagnant moment. Normally this is where I would say makes sense, but I can't see you guys. So, all right. So coming out as LGBT is often not believed or taken seriously, and also sometimes coming out with a non-visible disability, you see the same experience as well of not necessarily being believed or taken seriously. So there's a lot of overlaps between those. Bisexuals are far less likely to be out to the important people in our lives, and this is recent research from the Pew Center, which saw that gay and lesbian individuals, 75% of them were out to all or most of their of the people in their lives, whereas you only saw that among 19% of people who are bisexual. 24% of people who are bisexual were out to some of those people, 31% were out to only a few, and 26% were out to none, right? And so the idea that bisexual people don't feel comfortable being out is a really important one, but also it's important to understand that a lot of these people who identify as gay or lesbian may actually be bisexual and not feel like it's comfortable or safe to be out. Similarly, a lot of the people who identify as heterosexual, right, are probably bisexual but don't feel comfortable being out, don't feel like it's a safe thing for them to do. So when we talk about bisexuals being 50% of the LGBT community, that's actually probably an undercount because it's not counting all of these people that do not feel comfortable or feel like it is safe for them to be out, which raises another issue, which is it's not always safe for people to come out. And that's important to be accepting of as well. So let's talk a little bit about invisibility and erasure. And we've kind of been talking about these things the whole time, but I wanted to give some definitions. So bisexual erasure, and this is from GLAAD, bisexual erasure or bisexual invisibility is a pervasive problem in which the existence or legitimacy of bisexuality, either in general or in regard to an individual, is questioned or just denied outright. So one of the mantras of the bi community is simply saying we exist, right? We exist, we're here too. And I also have an excerpt from my 2010 article on disability and bisexuality. You may have read it, you may not have. It has a lot of jargon, I apologize, but it includes a lot of the things that we're talking about today. And one of the things that I stated in it is that much like disability, bisexuality often finds itself trapped in a similar position of in/visibility, which is this paradoxical juxtaposition of both invisibility and hypervisibility. I know I told you there was jargon, I warned you. But basically what it is that people with disabilities and bisexuals are oftentimes hypervisible, even though at the same time they're invisible. They have this experience of feeling both at the same time. Right? So, and this has to do with the hypervisibility has a lot to do with this sort of surveillance culture that surrounds disability and bisexuality, as though it's something dangerous that needs to be watched. And then also this invisibility of having their experiences and perspectives not valued, not validated, not taken seriously. And so it's this very particular positionality in the world that is similar between these two groups. And bisexual people with disabilities, especially bisexual people of color with disabilities, really experience this position to the extreme. And it can be isolating, and it can be stigmatizing, and you can feel really cut off from a sense of community. Bisexuality is often erased from historical figures or events like we talked about earlier. And it's assumed oftentimes that bisexuality is already included in queer or LGBT plus spaces, programs, and materials. And because of this assumption, bisexual specific resources are not funded or created. And this affects healthcare, it affects employment, sex education, therapy and counseling, domestic violence and abuse prevention, policy, the list goes on and on. I remember once I saw a pamphlet on bisexual sex education, basically trying to just say, okay, how to be healthy in your sexual interactions aimed at the bi community. And it was amazing because it provided really specific targeted information to people who are bisexual, who may be thinking about encounters with people that have the same or different gender from themselves. And it provided much more comprehensive information, whereas otherwise they wouldn't really be getting the information they needed. Instead, they'd be trying to patchwork it together from sources that didn't specifically talk about their needs. So what we really need to see is that queer and LGBT plus spaces actually need to talk to the bi community and develop resources specific to their needs. Similarly, they need to talk to the disability community and make sure that they're creating resources specific to their needs as well, so that we actually have targeted information that's going to be meeting those needs. But if they aren't even having that conversation, then those resources aren't going to be created, or at least not in a way that's going to be effective, which is what we're seeing now for the most part. And hopefully one of the things that I think that this, that Tara's project is trying to address head on, and one of the reasons why I'm really glad that all of you are here with us today. So let's dip into health and mental health a little bit. And this is sort of a big one. According to Healthy People 2020, bisexuals are more likely to have general medical problems. And this includes things like cancer, heart disease, and obesity, pretty much everything across the board. They're also less likely to have health insurance. And they have more difficulty obtaining needed medical care. A lot of times bisexuals aren't believed when they go to the doctors. And if you're a disabled person, this is familiar to you as well, right? A lot of times when you go to see your doctor, they focus just on the disability and they don't actually talk with you about the reason that you're there in the first place. The same thing can sometimes happen with bisexuals, is if they do feel comfortable disclosing to their doctor, which may not be the case, then they may focus on their sexuality, and which is seen as dangerous and risky, and they might actually ignore the actual reason that they're there. Bisexuals are less likely to receive preventative care. so's the disability community. They're less likely to disclose their sexual orientation to a healthcare provider. 36% of bisexuals do not disclose, compared to 11.5% of gay men and lesbians. And I'm going to be honest, I personally don't disclose to my healthcare provider because I know I'm going to get different treatment if I do. And if it's necessary for the reason that I'm in there, I may disclose, but so far I haven't had a reason to disclose because I don't want to see that change in how they treat me, especially if it's a women's health doctor. And also, nearly half of bisexuals have experienced biphobia when accessing health services in some way, shape, or form. And that certainly has been true in my experience as well. And you'll see references for all these statistics at the end of the PowerPoint in case you want more information. So let's look at the mental health, right? Bisexuality affects people's mental health overall as well, or shall I say that the stigma affects their mental health. Let's look at why. Bi women report lower levels of social support and lower quality of life. And a lot of this has to do with bisexual women being so sexualized, being fetishized, and sort of the dangerous position this can put them in. And we're going to come back to that when we talk about intimate partner violence. Bisexual men experience, especially bisexual men of color, experience different stigmas and barriers that affect their mental health. And I would like to see research that looks specifically at the social support and quality of life measures, but I don't know that research exists yet in an accurate way. So hopefully that research will be done in the future. If you're looking for a research project, that might be right up your alley. Bisexuals also experience 2 to 3 times the rate of anxiety, depression, self-harm, suicidal ideation, eating disorders, and other mood disorders. Recent research has shown that mental health disparities are partly due to this mental stress of biphobia, having to live with the stigma and discrimination day in and day out. And we know that a very similar process happens to racial and ethnic minorities who have to endure racism on a regular basis, right? And so do we have research that looks at this in the disability community? I don't know, but I'm going to Google it right after to find out. If you know, please put it in the chat because I would love to read that. But we know that stress has an effect on our health and our mental health. It can suppress your immune system. It can make you, it can bring on, things that you have an indication for, right? Whether it's a psychological issue, it can trigger that, or whether it's a chronic health issue or an episodic issue you've been struggling with. Living with this stress does affect your health and mental health. It's no surprise then that so many bisexual people have disabilities, and it's probably actually been underreported. All right. So now let's check in with intimate partner violence. So bisexual men and women have a much higher rate of intimate partner violence. So do people with disabilities. One thing that we don't know is the incidence of intimate partner violence among bisexual men and women, or people. Actually, I shouldn't gender it. It'd be great if we found out among, bisexual trans people with disabilities, certainly, what the rate of intimate partner violence is there. Especially because bisexual people are so fetishized and sexualized. A lot of times bisexual women are seen as, I don't know if you've ever heard the term unicorn hunting before. If you're bisexual, you've certainly heard it, and you probably have experienced it in some way. It's where a seemingly straight couple goes out hunting, looking for a young bisexual woman to bring into the relationship. And it's not actually a relationship. They want to bring into the bedroom. And it's very predatory and it's very exploitative. And a lot of times it's driven by the male member of that heterosexual couple. And and a lot of times it's exploitative of the female member of that couple. But sometimes that individual, the bisexual woman that's being drawn into that, oftentimes they're treated poorly. It can become abusive, and it's really just exploitative all around. And it's really a problem in the bi community. we don't see unicorn hunting among bisexual men, because bisexual men are kind of seen as, like, taboo. They have a lot of difficulty finding community, finding people because they're believed to be responsible for spreading disease, right? And this is, in fact, the explanation I heard once in a graduate class I took, that basically said that bisexual men, who would meet on the down low, were responsible for spreading AIDS and HIV among the straight and gay communities, right? And we know intellectually that that's not true. That's not at all true. That's not how it works. However, that's the stigma that they've been saddled with. And so bisexual men are often seen as dirty, as deviant, as dangerous, as cheaters, as and as someone that someone doesn't want to be in a relationship with. Whereas bisexual women are seen as these sexual fetishized people that you don't necessarily want to be in a relationship with, but that you want to have sex with, right? And so this entire environment leads to violence, and it leads to the promotion of the stigma of people who are bisexual. I probably went off a little too long there, but how to transition. Similarly, disabled people are also at a greater risk of violence, and this has to do with their vulnerable position in relationships where they rely on somebody for help, right? We know now that, even though we prize independence in the disability community, independence doesn't happen in a vacuum. You still need help. It's other people that allow you to be independent, other people and technology and services. These are the things that allow you to be independent and to live your best life. It's interdependence that allows us to really be independent. But that also puts you in a vulnerable position if there are people that you rely on for your independence, which means that people with disabilities can be taken advantage of and exploited almost too easily. And in fact, if you look at the statistics from the World Health Organization, adults with disabilities are 1.5 times more likely to be a victim of violence. Children with disabilities are 3.7 times more likely to be a victim of physical and sexual violence or neglect. And children with mental and intellectual impairments are 4.6 times higher, have a higher risk of sexual violence in particular. And this doesn't even break it down by sexuality. Sexual violence has a significant lifelong effect on someone's health and mental health. So the fact that the bi and the disability communities have experienced such high rates of violence, it's no wonder that they're experiencing disparities in health and mental health. And we really need to be providing better services and supports and funding services and supports specific to these areas and these areas of needs, especially ones that are disability led and that directly address the needs of the disability and the bi community, especially where they overlap and intersect. Because if you look at all these statistics we've gone through, you can see that the need is there, but it's as though we don't see it. It's, invisible, right? So it's really important that we actually look at it. I forgot about my graph, and this one thankfully is on the screen. So here you can see the rate of intimate partner violence broken down by sexual orientation, where gay men typically experience 26% rate of violence, IPV. For straight men, it's 29%. For straight women, it's about 35%. For bisexual men, it's about 37.3%, though that's very likely an undercount. For lesbians, it's around 43.8%. But then for bisexual women, it jumps all the way up to 61%. Now, when we think about the fact that bisexuals comprise about 50% of the LGBT community, and they're much more likely to have a disability, the fact that we haven't really done any work in the area of disability and bisexuality seems a gross oversight. So I really want to invite all of you here today to think about this, to discuss this with the people in your world, in your community, in your circle, and to try and think about, okay, well, what can I do? Even if it's something small, even if it's just talking about it, that's really important. And then here, of course, are all of the resources. I also have a picture of a bisexual whale in the bisexual pride color. I don't know if you're aware of this, but puns and finger guns are part of what makes bisexual culture unique. So I had to include a pun. And I think that's everything for my thing today. And I would love to hear what questions you guys have.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was really, really, really interesting. And I know I've seen your presentation before. A couple other people in the chat saw it as well. Just so much great information. Everyone should have received the slides today. Christine Beck sent those out earlier, which is amazing. So everyone will have this information. But we have some time left. So we want to hear from you. Are there any questions that you have for Kate? Is this something that you've encountered in your work? Is this new to you? What are people's thoughts and feelings? So we've got, thank you, Kate. So great, lots learned and lots to think about.
Great. Thanks, Jen. Yeah, I'd love to hear if you have any questions, or if there's even just something that you weren't clear about.
Right.
If there's anything that was confusing. I know I sometimes rush. Again, Anne, you're amazing. Thank you for interpreting. I'm sorry for the areas where I talked too fast. Thank you.
Okay, looks like we've got a couple questions. Do you want to take those, Kate?
Yeah, so what's the difference between bisexual and pan? Now, this has been a controversial area because there, for some reason in recent years, people have been trying to pit the bi and pan communities against each other when we're actually part of the same community. Some will say that pansexuality is under the umbrella of bisexuality. However, some people don't feel that way, and people should feel free to identify however they identify. When we're looking at the definitions, bisexuality means that you're attracted to someone of the same gender as you, as well as other genders. So it's not two genders, right? It doesn't create a binary, but it's just same and other. So you can be attracted to someone who is agender or trans. Whereas pansexuality, you're attracted to someone regardless of their gender. Gender doesn't even factor into it. It's not important, right? That's not what attracts you to somebody. Let's look at what the next question is. What would you suggest for the disability community to better support self-advocates who are bisexual? I think the best way is to talk about it, to acknowledge it. Anytime where, I mean, first of all, the disability community needs to be better about the LGBT plus community as a whole, but anytime where you're doing any LGBT plus programming, make sure that there's actually a space for bisexuals to identify themselves, to have conversations and to contribute and to belong. That's really important. And a lot of times it gets sort of swept aside because people assume it's already included, when in fact it's not. There's actually a long history of lesbian and gay spaces and queer spaces excluding bisexual people. And I know saying that always gets me in trouble, but crack open an issue of the Journal of Bisexuality and you will see it there in droves. Let's see. I have a person on my caseload who says he's bisexual. The mom disagrees. I can't wait to share this information. Yes, we see this all the time. A lot of times people don't have the option to identify as bisexual. I kind of wonder sometimes if I would have identified that way if I had known it was an option earlier. Because I knew I wasn't straight. I knew I wasn't a lesbian, but I didn't know that bisexual was an option. And as soon as I did, I was like, oh, that works. That makes sense. That is me. And so a lot of times, you know, just giving people the opportunity is all they need. But even then, sometimes it might not be safe for them to come out, especially when they identify as bisexual. And then Jin asks, is it okay for folks to say bi, or should we use bisexuality to be respectful? You can say bi. You can say bi or bisexual. One of the things historically that's happened is when strategic essentialism has been used in order to further you know, rights for the LGBT plus community. A lot of times advocates decided they didn't want to use the word bisexual because they felt that, or homosexual actually for that matter, because they didn't want to remind conservatives that sex was involved. And so they said, well, if we say lesbian or gay, then it doesn't have the word sex in there. But how do you say bisexual without saying bisexual? And they didn't want to include just bi because they didn't think it was clear enough. And so what ended up happening was there was an argument for a period of several years that sort of came to a head when the Marriage Equality Act really came to the forefront. And that's the reason why in the Marriage Equality Act is not actually about equality for gay or lesbian marriage. It's actually about same-sex marriage. And that's because that was inclusive of bisexuals. Whereas previously when they tried to make it gay and lesbian marriage equality, then bisexuals were kind of like, well, what about us? So it's actually great to say bi or bisexual. Either is acceptable. Really the problem comes when you try to avoid saying it altogether, and that ends up becoming erasure. And then Demetra says, I have a person at my work who's pansexual, but I never knew what that was. Thanks for that explanation. Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, it's really confusing. And you'll find that a lot of bisexual people don't understand what pansexuality means either. And sometimes they identify as both and feel as though they can't identify as both. But one of the beautiful things about the LGBT plus community is you can identify however you want, whatever feels like authentic for yourself. And so you'll see a lot of people who identify as more than one thing, bi and pan, queer and bi. A lot of times we see people identify as queer and bi because they want acceptance into the queer community, and sometimes they feel that's the only way that they can get that, unfortunately. And then I see Tara ask, how do support the individuals we serve in exploring their gender and sexual identity when parents and guardians aren't supportive? That is a fantastic question. Now, I work with people with intellectual disabilities, adults with intellectual disabilities, and that's certainly something that we run into all the time. We don't talk about sex and gender expression. We don't talk about sex in the intellectual disability community hardly ever, let alone sex and gender expression or orientation, even though it exists. I mean, if you look at the research, there's a very high degree of same-sex interactions in the intellectual disability community because their living arrangements are gender segregated. And they're looking for love, belonging, and romance, just like the rest of us, right? And so, so it is definitely something that we need to talk about. It's something we need to realize exists. And you know, a lot of times that means creating spaces where people can find community without their parents or guardians being present. Well, I mean, the guardianship issue adds a whole nother level. Although, technically, legally, guardianship is tied to specific areas of one's life, and it's a big gray area whether or not guardianship actually applies to, you know, sexual intimacy or not. Because how can a parent actually give consent for someone to have sex? That's weird. So, you know, that's a gray area in guardianship law that we actually need to address. All right, I'm going to move on to another question before I go deeper into that one. Can I talk more about non-binary? Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what to talk about non-binary. It's part of life. It's part of how people identify. There are plenty of people that are bisexual and who are non-binary or who are agendered. And who identify differently. We see a lot of people in the trans community who identify as bisexual. And sometimes that's because, you know, during their transition, they may find that their sexual orientation changes or that it doesn't change at all. And so identifying as bi or pan or choosing not to have any label for that at all is what fits best with the experience and perspective that they have as a whole. And so sometimes it works best not to try and label things. The problem, of course, with not labeling things is that then it becomes difficult to find community. It finds difficult to fund and to develop programs and practices for. But it's also something that people do on a regular basis. And so the question then becomes, well, how can we actually support the entire community without excluding anybody? Let's see. And then Barbara says, I didn't realize there was such a high level of violence with bisexual women and lesbians. Is there a reason why these two groups specifically? Is it attributed to excessively jealous partners? Very informative. I think there's much more research going on in this area and more qualitative research that's going to be going into exactly the reasons why. I can speak more specifically to the bisexual community, and it has to do very much with that sexualization, the over-sexualization and the fetishization of bisexual women, but also this belief that bisexual women are cheating. And then also I think it has to do with bisexual women sometimes feeling like they can't leave the relationship because they don't think anyone else will love them or accept them for being who they are, even if the person that they're with doesn't exactly love or accept them for who they are, right? And so it's this very abusive relationship that that they can find themselves in. Now, one thing that I should have clarified that I didn't when I talked about unicorn hunting earlier is that unicorn hunting has nothing to do with polyamory. Polyamory is it's a horse of a different color. It's a very different thing. The goal of polyamory is not to be exploitative. It's, you know, to have a healthy relationship with one's partners. And also polyamory is not interchangeable with bisexuality, although some bisexual people will choose to be polyamorous, just as, you know, oftentimes there are heterosexual and homosexual partners in that relationship. Also, polyamory is a whole bunch of work. Like, I think about having a healthy relationship with just one person. Having it with multiple partners and trying to make sure it's healthy and balanced is a lot of work. So the folks I know who are polyamorous are actually some of the hardest workers I know. So I just wanted to put that out there. And then I see that Jay Jin says that FYI, jealousy is not a cause or reason for domestic violence. Perpetrators actively choose to abuse. It's a choice, not caused by jealousy or other feelings. Domestic violence perpetrators are abusive to exert control and power. I agree with you, Jay Jin. It definitely is about control. But I think jealousy feeds into that. You know, it's an unequal power balance in a relationship where someone's trying to exploit the other person because they exert their control and power over that person and that person's, you know, relationships and interactions with other people, and it can manifest in a whole bunch of different ways. But I do think that jealousy is a motivation for it that leads to that can sort of stoke that fire, especially if someone is insisting that their partner cannot be faithful because of who they are. Does that make sense? And you can feel free to disagree. In fact, this sounds like a conversation that I would love to continue having with you. And these are exactly the types of conversations that we should be having. So I'm really excited to see all your questions. I don't even know if I was able to answer them, honestly, because they're really just things that we're starting to talk about, you guys. Yes, definitely. We're going to continue having this conversation. Is there anything else? Any other questions? Thoughts?
Well, hopefully we'll get some more questions, but I wanted to make mention that for those of you on the webinar today who are disability service providers, guardians, supporting individuals with disabilities, there is a new law, House Bill 3299, Public Act. I don't know the numbers. Jane, if you could drop it in the chat box, he's always really good about reminding me that it's a public act now. 101-0506. So this is really the sex ed bill. So this is a piece of legislation that was spearheaded by people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, along with the Illinois Guardianship and Advocacy Commission, and a bunch of other advocacy organizations to mandate sex ed for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who want to receive that information. And a part of that law is going to be determining consent capacity to make sure that people who, one, that they can get the information about gender and sexuality and all the things, and then also to help support them in making sure that they know all the risks and the benefits and that they can be healthy and safe in exploring their sexuality. So that's something that we have worked really hard to support. And so some of the other webinars that we recorded for this series are on our website, selfadvocacyalliance.org, which you can check out the recordings for, where we talk a lot about what service providers can do, rape crisis center staff, people with disabilities, what you can do in your own life and with your own advocacy. So a lot of these resources are already out there. Just wanted to make mention of that.
You know, thank you, Tara. I meant to mention it and I forgot to, but that is a really important piece of legislation. And I'm really glad that you guys have really been spearheading that, making sure it's being done in a good way. So thank you so much for all of that work.
Right, absolutely. So it looks like we're kind of winding down here. No more questions or comments. Dr. Kate Caldwell, we want to thank you so much for your time and expertise in this area. So many pearls of wisdom here. I know when I saw this presentation, I have thought about it and referred to it in conversations at dinner parties, over cocktails. It's so much incredible information. And I think that it's really important to start having these conversations and really figuring all this out. So thank you so much for your wisdom. Yeah.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks to everybody for listening to this and for doing all the work that you do. Everybody here is really doing important work. So,
absolutely. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much. And just to remind everyone, we are still waiting on approval from the Department of Human Services regarding CEUs. So Christine Beck, my amazing colleague, will be in touch with you all regarding that. And then we do have a couple other webinars coming up. Let's see, we have continuing the journey of mobilizing support for people with disabilities who have experienced sexual violence. That's going to take place Tuesday, December 15th. And then our last event will be Healthy Sexuality and Sexual Expression panel discussion, Thursday, December 17th at night. So again, check out our website for more. And if you want to email me, my email is Tara, T-A-R-A .advocacy, ADVOCACY @gmail.com. So we're happy to connect you with Kate or answer any questions that you may have or share any other resources. So thanks again. We hope you all enjoyed this and have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Be safe, everybody.